when we publish our report in March, we'll be making what we hope to be some useful recommendations. I'd also like to thank the Royal Statistical Society, who've provided us with rooms and victuals throughout our inquiry. Mainly, I would like to extend my personal gratitude to the inquiry team, who have really, pro bono, worked extremely hard over the past sort of 8-9 months to bring together what's been a really sort of complex set of data into what I think is a very compelling narrative. It's also very important that I acknowledge our thanks as an inquiry team to Rosie Shorrocks from Oxford and Jack Blumenow in the front here, who have been ably assisting us in putting all this data together and running various analyses. They've been extremely helpful and very, very competent, and I recommend them to chair the 2035 polling. Okay, so just a little word about the scope of this meeting today. First of all, this is our inquiry has been into the methodology of polls. There are lots of other interesting issues about whether polls should be allowed and whether they affect the outcome and so on of the election, which we're all interested in, but our inquiry has not been tasked with looking at those kinds of matters. Again, to emphasise that this is a presentation of our preliminary findings and conclusions. Our final findings and conclusions and recommendations will be sent to the BPC in March, and we, as long as they get things back to us in time, we'll publish those in March. We aren't therefore making specific recommendations today, but we will be touching on those, and I'll be sort of talking in general terms about the kinds of recommendations that we will be making, and we're very happy to take questions on potential recommendations. So the first thing that we did as an inquiry panel was to try and get a sense of quite how bad was 2015. And we have done some kind of historical and comparative analyses of polling misses, well, not just polling misses, but when the pollsters got it right all around the world, to set this in context. And actually, what I'm going to show you here is a sort of a subset of what we've looked at. I'm not going to be looking at the comparative evidence. Of course, what we're presenting here today is quite constrained by time. So in the report, we will go into more detail and we will cover cross-national comparisons as well as historical comparisons. But for now, we're just going to be looking at the British historical evidence. So here's a shot that I can, when this was beamed up, this is kind of a bit of a flashbulb memory for many people in the room, I imagine. Sticks in the memory. We can all remember where we were when we heard the outcome of the exit poll. It was a very big surprise. It was a big surprise because, of course, the polls had led us to believe that the outcome was going to be pretty much a dead heat. Here are the final polls, final poll estimates. BPC members at the top and the two non-BPC members at the bottom, and you can see, as I guess many of you in this room know, that pretty much all of them were saying it was going to be a statistical dead heat. Of 11 estimates there, 10 are either 0 or 1 or minus 1 for a Labour lead. So a really strong consensus, and a consensus that proved to be wrong. Here's a number that I like. It's a little very, very simple chart. As I'll say a little bit more when I talk about the evidence that we've looked at, we asked the pollsters to give us 3 polls that they'd done during the short campaign. The first poll, the penultimate poll, and the final poll. And we've put all these together into one data set to do various analyses. This data set has over 47,000 respondents in it. And this is a chart with just the raw frequency of those who said they were going to vote Labour and those who said they were going to vote Conservative. 15,291 Conservative, 15,368. So less than 100 people different across the two parties. So whatever adjustments were going to be made to the raw data, they were going to have to do quite a lot of work to go from there to a 7-point lead. So a bit of context for what we've been looking at in the inquiry and the sorts of, what polls were done. During the short campaign, there were 91 polls in Great Britain, 13 in Scotland, 4 Wales only. There are also constituency polls by Lord Ashcroft. We have looked at the constituency polls, but they're rather different in a number of important ways, so we're not going to be saying anything about those constituency polls today. Here's some data that Will Jennings has pulled together in the historical analysis, and a stat that I think is really interesting in terms of the sort of the quantity of polls that are being done now. During the 2010 to 2015 Parliament, there were 1,942 polls with vote intention done, and that compares to 3,500 in the whole history of polling. Okay, so that tells us something about the increase in volume of the polls. And here's another chart that shows us pretty much the same thing. People often use the word exponential incorrectly, but I think this is exponential. We're doing a lot more. I mean, this is obviously reflecting the move to online and the much lower unit cost of doing polls and so on, but something that we'll be considering is what the implications of the sudden increase in the number of polls. We can look historically here as well at how accurate or inaccurate polls have been in different ways. What we're looking at here in this chart is on the x-axis is going back to 1945. So this is the sort of the unweighted average of the final polls. Okay, the first observation is the 1945, and this is the mean absolute error, and with 0 indicated here. And so on the Conservative share, you can see that it's not uncommon for the polls to be out on the Conservative share by a couple of percentage points. There are some outliers, of which 2015 is one, and you can also see a bit of a sort of a drift, so that the error is growing on the Conservative share over time. And that is, of course, despite the fact that the pollsters have been, taking measures to correct for a tendency to overestimate the Conservative share. So there's something potentially systematic there. We've been, or Will has been looking at that as part of his work, and there's indications that there's something systematic going on there, but we haven't bottomed that out completely yet. On the Labour share, it's a bit more variable, but certainly a tendency to overestimate Labour. Here's the error on the lead. Okay, the key parameter with the 0 point there, and you can see. I mean, I think the point to sort of get to the nub of things here. If we were to if we'd looked at this slide in April of 2015. And we'd removed this point here, the 2015 miss, and we then said, well, would we be really surprised given this historical spread if the lead ended up here? Well, we'd be disappointed, but not massively surprised, perhaps. This is within the historical range of misses. And the other thing to note here, if we look, 97, 2001, that the error on the lead was not too different from 2008, but of course they got the election right there, because that was Labour way ahead. So overestimating Labour when they won that didn't cause any ructions. Okay, so the same error, or approximately the same error, can lead to very different conclusions about how accurate the polls are depending on the particular circumstances of an election.
Could you remind us which were the points where we had other polling inquiries?
I don't know if I'm old enough to do that, but I think we had one in 1970, 92 and 70.
My recollection is that the extreme ones at the bottom, each one generated
Yes.
a polling inquiry. So it's not really fair to say we weren't surprised. The question is, we've been surprised again.
This is true. This is true. Yes. Yes. This is not the first, and may well not be the last, as I implied earlier. So yes, we don't think that the 2015 election was massively out of line, or indeed should have been hugely unexpected given historical precedent. So, turning to what we've done in our inquiry, we've tried to sort of, if you like, identify the possible set of potential causes, and to look at each one in turn and to assess the evidence for each of the potential causes. It's worth saying that the evidence here is far from perfect. We're often having to rely on partial, incomplete, and not very high quality data, and our conclusions are a balance of probabilities. We're not able to say, this definitely happened in this way. We're having to rule things out by saying this seems, given the evidence, this potential cause seems unlikely to have contributed anything more than a modest amount, that sort of language. And what we're not doing, we noted in the 92 inquiry report, there was kind of an attempt to break things down into saying late swing contributed to 3% of the miss, and 40 quotas was 4% of the. We're not trying to attempt a mathematical decomposition of the total miss. We just don't think that is certainly not feasible mathematically. So we're using sort of qualitative descriptors which get at the same idea, while being transparent that we're not attempting to decompose that number. So as I said, we've got 3 polls from each pollster. We have the first, the penultimate, and the final polls. We also have the recontact data from the pollsters. If they did a recontact survey, I think there were 6 recontact surveys undertaken from the 9 BPC members. We asked for data from the main parties and from Lord Ashcroft, but that wasn't forthcoming. We didn't expect it to be, but we asked. We've also used contemporaneous probability surveys, as have others. Recently, John Curtis and the British Election Study team have both looked at the British Election Study and the British Social Attitude Survey. We have been able to publish, to replicate all of the estimates that the pollsters published with the raw data that they have provided. And it's worth just pausing for a moment. The pollsters have been very cooperative, helpful, transparent. When we've gone back and asked for things, they've provided clarifications. There have been no problems of that nature, and that's very good to report. It's certainly not the experience of our colleagues in the US who, when they attempted an inquiry of this nature, ended up establishing a transparency initiative to move in this direction. So we should congratulate the pollsters on their approach to this inquiry. Here's a graph, and I'll just talk you through it briefly because we're going to be seeing a few of these. It's not too difficult to understand, but I'll run through the main points. The y-axis is the difference between the Conservatives and Labour. The green line is the result, so that the true value is the green line here. And these dots are the estimates from the polls, or later we'll see from surveys. So you can see here that for the first polls, these also, by the way, are the replicate estimates. So these are our estimates, but they are within very small degrees the same as the published estimates from the pollsters. Again, that's good. We were able, Jack and Rosie were able to replicate these estimates from the information provided and the micro data, and you can see that these estimates kind of change from the first day of the campaign to the final polls, when they're kind of agreeing that there's going to be essentially a zero lead with a bit of variability. Now, there's probably some interest, not least from the pollsters, in trying to identify which of those circles relate to them. And a lot of these charts you're going to see, we're not going to put not least because it make the charts look very messy, but we don't want that to be the focus today. I mean, we're not trying to hide it. When people look at the report, they'll probably be able to figure out who's who, and if they ask us, we'll tell them. But we're not making that a feature of today. In approaching this diagnosis of the problem, we are primarily interested in general causes. I mean, that's not to say that we're not interested in the specific causes that may have only affected one pollster, but our primary interest has been in things which are happening more or less across the board. Of course, that doesn't mean that if we identify a general cause that it applies to all pollsters or it applies equally to all pollsters. There may be some where a particular error is less evident. Nor that some pollsters, there may be some errors that particular pollsters were subject to that we are not spending a lot of time talking about today. I seem to have lost a slide there. Never mind. I can ad-lib. Taking that approach, what we've done is look at each of the potential causes that we identified, and we've got a set that we are effectively ruling out as having really made no contribution, or at most a very modest contribution to the polling miss. I'm not going to say a huge amount about these today. We'll present all the evidence for how we got to that conclusion in the report, but we want to focus on what we think the problems were rather than what the problems were not. So here is our list of things that we think were unlikely to have had an effect. Postal voting, we think that there is something interesting about postal voting. We'll be saying a bit more about postal voting in a later section, but we don't think that it had an independent effect beyond, if you like, the representativeness of the sample. So we'll come back to that. But postal voting, we're more or less ruling out. Voter registration, we've still got some work to do on this, actually, from the BES voter validation study. But our initial conclusion is that this wasn't a factor. What would have been going on here would be that people who told the pollsters they were going to vote for Labour, in particular, would have gone to the polling booth and then found that they weren't actually registered to vote because of the change in the registration system. There's no kind of anecdotal evidence that really happened very much, and our initial investigation suggests that it didn't, and if it did anyway, it would be a small effect. So that's also in our list of things that we think didn't make a contribution. Overseas voters, not enough of them, only about 0.2% of voters, so even if they all voted Conservative and were missed out, then it wouldn't make any difference. Question wording and framing has come up as a sort of putative mechanism, and we actually more others than we, but the YouGov, the BES team have looked at various kind of combinations of where questions and how questions are asked, and have done also some kind of randomised experiments and have not found anything in the question wording and framing. It's not to say that question wording can't make a difference, but there's nothing systematic that's leading to this underestimation across pollsters. Differential turnout, here we could have a situation where essentially lazy Labour, more Labour voters are saying they're certain to vote, and then when it comes to election day they don't actually vote, and that benefits the Conservatives on election day relative to the final polls. There have been some validation studies, and in the recontact surveys we don't find any strong evidence there. There's maybe a little bit going on there. We haven't again quite bottomed that out, but it's in the category of doesn't look like there's anything going on if there was something going on, it was very modest. Last of all, mode of interview. Again, to qualify this, we're not saying there was no differences at all according to mode, but in terms of the headline picture, were online doing way better than phone, or phone better than an online in terms of the error? No, there's no evidence that either of the modes of interview per se were doing better or worse. So that takes us to what's left. And we have what's left as the selection of samples, and as Yoni Kuhar, my colleague on the panel, will run through in a moment, this comprises essentially three components: obtaining a sample of voters, weighting to population targets, and then weighting by likelihood of voting. So we look at each of those stages. Also, late swing is a possibility that we haven't looked at yet. This is that people who tell the pollsters that they don't know who they're going to vote for, they're not sure, they refuse, they switch to a party, the Conservatives, in this instance, on election day. Or people are switching from, they're telling the pollsters, I'm going to vote Labour, and they switch to Conservative from between parties. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. The last thing that people are often interested in is deliberate misreporting. Now, on this one, if people deliberately misreport in the pre-election poll, but then they tell the truth in the recontact survey, then this collapses to late swing. It may, in their heads it may be something different, but in terms of what we observe, it's the same. So we can look at that in the same way. If they repeatedly misreport to the pollsters, then really there's no way of there are some very indirect ways of looking at that, but nothing very satisfactory. But there is a lot of circumstantial evidence which would suggest that this seems unlikely. People would have to be lying to the pollsters the day after, but not to the exit poll, not to the BES, not to the BSA. So there are sort of circumstantial patterns of evidence which suggest that deliberate misreporting certainly may happen in individual cases, but the idea that it's kind of a systematic error leading to the miss seems very unlikely. And herding. This isn't really something that's going to account for the miss so much, but people have been commenting on the rather surprising consensus of the polls, that it was essentially zero. 10 out of 11 of the final polls had either a 0 or 1% lead. And you've seen some of the charts I put up already, I think, kind of showing things converging. So what we've tried to do is to look at this very dispassionately and just say, what would our expectation be, or what would reasonable expectations of the variation in the estimate of the lead be, and how does the actual variance compare to that? And we also looked at some of the design, the adjustment changes that the pollsters made to see if that was sort of essentially pulling them towards a consensus of a dead heat. So, with that, I am going to draw to a close and hand over to Yoni Kuhar,